Good morning. My name is Brian Gallachóir and I'm the director of MaREI. MaREI is the SFI Research Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this launch of a very important report that arose out of a collaborative piece of research between MaREI and the Electricity Association of Ireland. Just a few housekeeping things to start. I just want to let people know that this is being recorded so we can share it with people afterwards. We would ask you to interact during the course of the morning and send your questions via Slido. So if you type in sli.do into your mobile phone device, web browser, or alternatively on your laptop, and if you put in the code capital E, capital A, capital I, that'll take you to where we have our Q&A session. The report that we're launching this morning, our Zero Emission Future, is available on the EAI website with some appendices with some supplementary information. Now, just to introduce you very briefly to MaREI in terms of where this report is coming from our perspective, our goal is to do excellent research that has impact. We have 220 researchers around Ireland working on topics relating to energy, climate and marine in 13 institutes, including UCC and many other universities and research institutions around the country. The excellent research that you're going to see here arises from a research programme that's been led by Paul Dean over the last number of years in power systems modelling. And the impact relates to how we engage and use that research. So our impact strategy within MaREI focuses on informing policy, supporting industry and empowering society. And the way in which we support industry, we have three different approaches to that. We help companies to decarbonise, so the likes of the pharmaceutical factories down in Ringaskiddy or the distillery in Middleton. So individual companies who wish to decarbonise, we help them on that journey with research and analysis. We also support companies to develop what might be an idea into a commercial activity. So we've some small scale wave and tidal energy devices that are good examples here. Ocean Energy is a company based in Cove who've recently built a wave energy device in Portland, Oregon, and are testing it in Hawaii. We also have a G-Kinetic, a tidal energy company, who's built a device that's been tested in France. And a third strand of our support for industry is supporting industry partners in developing their strategies. So we've done some collaborative research with ESB, helping them to take a leadership role in the electrification of energy and decarbonisation of electricity, equally with Arvea on the decarbonisation of the gas network. And here is a further example, this collaboration with the Electricity Association of Ireland. So I'm looking forward to a great event. We're going to have Laura Mehigan, who is the lead author on the report, will give a presentation. And we'll hear some feedback then from Richard Rodgers, the head of energy from the Department of Economy in Northern Ireland. And we'll also have a presentation from, or a feedback from Eurelectric. So I'm looking forward to a great event. We would encourage you to, as I say, to interact through the Q&A function. We're very honoured to have some remarks from the Minister Eamon Ryan, who has seen the report and will give some reflections from his perspective. But the first thing I'd like to do is to hand over to Dara Lynott from the Electricity Association of Ireland to give some opening remarks and to effectively launch the event. Over to you, Dara.
Just to make sure everyone hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, great. Good morning, everybody. You're all very welcome. I believe there's over 350 people registered for this event, which is marvellous. Just very much to thank Brian and the MaREI Centre for hosting this webinar. And like Brian, just to give you a bit of an overview of the Electricity Association of Ireland, we are an all-island representative body, and our members represent the electricity value chain from electricity generation and distribution through to the retail supply of energy to the final consumer. We developed our strategy, our current strategy, about 2 years ago, and part of the vision behind that strategy was a decarbonised future powered by electricity. And as part of developing that strategic objective, which is to achieve a cost-effective transition to a net zero all-island economy, we asked the MaREI Centre to examine the question, and the question was, what will the all-island electricity system look like in 2030 as it meets the challenges of renewable electricity policy, decarbonisation and the security of supply? Laura and Paul have done a fantastic job in preparing this report, and I'm sure that you'll agree when you hear Laura speak about it. I look forward to hearing Laura's contribution and also the reflections of Minister Ryan. Very happy to welcome Richard Rodgers, Head of Energy for the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland, and Heather, who is the Chief Policy Officer for Eurelectric. I'd also like to thank the EAI members for funding the study and remind everyone that the report is available to download on eaireland.com website. So I'll hand back over to you, Eamon.
Thank you very much, Dara. So now what we'll have is, before we go into the detail of the report, we'll have some reflections from the Minister for Environment, Climate and Communications, Eamon Ryan. And we've given him this report, and he's kindly taken time out to pre-record a message for the event. So over to you, Minister. Thank you very much.
Hello. Can I share a few of my own thoughts, having read the paper and looked at the analysis behind it? First, I think there is increasing understanding now that actually renewable power is going to be the future of generation in this country. In onshore wind, where we have a particular comparative advantage, in the development of solar power, but also in the development of our offshore renewables electricity resources. It's now coming, that technology has become competitive. It's been developed with scale right across Europe. And we, with our wind resource and our sea area being 10 times our land area, have a real opportunity to develop a power supply that will not just power our country, but also give us a surplus to help meet our neighbouring countries' needs and help us balance towards a net zero carbon society. In this area, in offshore renewables, as in onshore, there's increasing realization, and the report sets out that actually managing the grid and making sure that the grid can actually cope, particularly with our island isolated synchronized system, is getting that grid design and grid issues right is what's going to be absolutely key. I thought it was very interesting in that regard to look at your report, the analysis of what could be done if we were to go beyond the existing targets, looking at further interconnection than what is planned, looking at new technologies as a way of providing that inertia on the grid to keep it operating. I think that is where the real potential lies and where real expertise exists in this country, in EirGrid and elsewhere, so that we can actually achieve that level of ambition and that level of change. Secondly, critical to grid is actually the demand side of the equation. This is all about this new industrial electricity revolution is about balancing supply and demand. I thought it was fascinating in your study, that analysis to show that if we didn't meet our heat pump targets, for example, to take one example, I think it was if it was less than 150,000 less heat pumps than we had projected, not only would we see 100,000 tons reduction in what we would achieve on the carbon emission side, on the demand side, but that in the generation side, it would also equate to almost 1 million tons, 900,000 tons of carbon that wouldn't be reduced just by missing that one load flexibility. In electrifying everything, in our transport system and our heat system, we have this real potential to switch things on and off in a synchronized, intelligent manner, to add to the grid with other flywheel and other technologies that give us the inertia to manage that system. To use gas as we go to the zero carbon future on those very rare occasions when we have long high pressure systems in place. And it's seeing gas in that light, it makes sense as just one of the series of different techniques we have to balance the power supply. It's backup, it's not the main generation supply. Thirdly, I think what's critical and what comes out from the report is the need for us to have an all-island approach. We've already started that. It was very interesting back in 10 years ago when we started in some of these higher ambitious targets. Northern Ireland went for the same level of renewables, 40%, that we did in the south, and we both met that target. I think we both learned a lot from that, and we can do the same as we now go to the next target, which we have both north and south, of a 70% renewable electricity system. It makes real sense to have the one spinning reserve. It makes real sense to share the expertise and knowledge that we have. And it makes sense as well, as we're doing that, to recognise that not only do we have to get this interconnection built north-south, we critically need that north-south interconnector, but also we need to think bigger and thinking east-west as well at the same time, and thinking about further interconnection with the continent and with the UK. One of the figures that really jumped out to me in the study was as we aim to get our emissions down below 6.2 million tonnes from electricity, in fact we have to go to zero, we know that some 2.9 million tonnes of additional savings could be made with the introduction of additional renewable resources and additional interconnection. That's the model, that's the vision I see of the future. Ireland developing a grid planned by the state, bringing in development to provide the generation that is needed, an industrial economy or an industrial system which is powered off that, which gives us real strength into the future, but also being part of a wider Northwest European electricity market. It's critical in that regard that no matter what happens with Brexit, that the UK is still part of that energy market system. It won't make any sense for the UK if it tries to go it alone. If it tries to develop this renewable future as an isolated system, it would be too expensive. It would make all the other industries unviable because the cost of electricity will be too high. So we need to coordinate north-south, but also east-west, and think bigger and think beyond the initial target of 2030, but think where we're going to 2050, when we're completely net zero, where we're an actual exporter of this surplus renewable power, meeting our own needs, but also meeting wider needs. It's that vision or that scale of ambition which is what will bring us in the right direction. I'm convinced that industry understands and sees that. I also see in all the work I do that the finance systems and other people with an interest in this area also know that this now is the way things are going to go. The game is over. Renewables are winning because the cost of solar and the cost of wind is coming down consistently. The real winners will be those who learn how to integrate it into a variable balancing supply and demand grid, both at an international level and also right down to the local distribution grid level. So that's what the work the Electricity Association has to do for the future, and MaREI, supporting all of us working together in working out how can Ireland do this best? How can we be the leading country in making this new electrical industrial revolution take place? It's not beyond our bounds of our capability. In fact, we have real expertise in the area. We have learnt by doing. We're actually ahead of the game in terms of how you make this happen. It's up to us now to take it further, to go completely net zero, ahead of the targets that have already been set, to help other industries play their part in this transition we have to make. I wish you very best of luck with the conference today. I want to thank MaREI and the Electricity Association for the report, which feeds into our thinking, and I look forward to sitting down with you post-COVID around the table to help make sure we all make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that. Those reflections on our report. There was a couple of things that jumped out at me. The mention early on in your words on the offshore potential that we have, and yesterday, of course, the EU offshore renewable energy strategy was announced. You mentioned the all-island focus, and I think that was very well reflected in what all the speakers mentioned today and the Q&A. And also, of course, while this report focuses on 70 by 30, the need to look beyond that, and that doesn't reduce the challenges of getting to 70-30, but that 70 by 30 is really in the context of wider challenges. So thank you very much for that, Minister. And so I'm delighted to introduce Laura Mehigan, who's the lead author, and she's going to take us through the main findings. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and I hope you can all hear me. And
yeah.
Good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to give you my reflections on this study. I wonder, could we get my slides up, please? Thank you. So it's a science-based study looking at the all-island electricity system for the year 2030, focusing on decarbonisation. We're used to having a very reliable and secure supply of electricity on this island, and this needs to continue as we move along the path to decarbonisation. So it's reassuring that the portfolios considered in this study have been checked to be adequate in line with current reliability standards, and also that over 250,000 hours or 30 years of weather data has been considered in the analysis, as weather is having an increasing impact on the system as more renewables connect. By 2030, we expect to see more interconnection on the all-island system, so it's fitting that this study considers a pan-European model, including the EU27, Norway and the UK. Now, models cannot predict the future, but they can provide us with insights, and this is where I see the value of this study, as it considers over 7 scenarios and sensitivities. Next slide, please. It gives us an idea of the kind of changes that are required to achieve an all-island electricity system in 2030, whose emissions are significantly reduced from where they are today, whose emissions are just on the outer envelope of what is required to be in line with the obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. And while batteries and demand-side units will play a very important role, particularly in providing flexibility to the system, the study shows that the 2030 all-island system is largely dependent on energy from renewables and gas-fired plants. When I think back to when I started my career in the electricity industry in 2003, there was just 300 megawatts of wind connected to the all-island system. And I look at where it is now at 5.5 gigawatts. And I think that's just phenomenal, and great credit is due for that. The electricity industry on this island has shown itself to be pioneering, and that it can rapidly adapt. And that gives me great hope, because when I look at what's needed to get to 2030 and what we need to get to in 2030, we're going to need lots more of that pioneering spirit, because it's such a short time frame. To achieve this 2030 scenario that I'm showing here, a larger capacity of renewables has to connect in the next 9 years than has connected in the previous 20. And there's other changes needed too. There's the increase in batteries, there's the network reinforcements and other solutions needed to eradicate local constraints or network bottlenecks. There's the research required and new technologies to allow a relaxation of system non-synchronous penetration limit and the minimum inertia level. And then there's also electrification. And these challenges, they're not to be underestimated. And while I believe the industry is poised to take them on, it can only be achieved if everyone in society plays their part and supports the path to decarbonisation. Next slide, please. In the past, there was a tendency to view electricity through a rather narrow lens. And even though it's improved significantly in recent years, it's worth reiterating how important it is that we view electricity in the context of the wider energy system, especially when we're striving for decarbonisation. And there's a lovely example of this in the report that I'm showing here that demonstrates this point. In the base case, there was 1 million EVs and 750,000 heat pumps. And in a lower electrification scenario, there was 20% less of these. And the CO2 emissions from the lower electrification scenario were 0.1 megaton less if we look purely at the power system emissions. But when we consider and add in the emissions that have been avoided by increased electrification, it's actually a net increase of 0.8 megatons to the wider system. So electrification is important not just in providing flexible demand for the electricity system, it has a significant role in reducing emissions in the wider energy system. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you some of the graphs from the Dunkelflaute analysis, and I'll apologise to Henning and any other German speakers out there for my pronunciation. Kalte Dunkelflaute is the German, I believe, for cold, dark doldrums, and it refers to a period of prolonged low wind and low solar. And in the report, the analysis is not just confined to periods like this, like a typical Dunkelflaute. It also looks at a range of weather extremes. And perhaps it's because I worked with the Irish TSO for well over a decade, and that some of that time was spent on shift dispatching generation. But I found this part of the analysis particularly fascinating, because it shows how extremely flexible the system will have to be to cope with different weather patterns. And this graph that we're looking at here, it's a 2-week period of high renewable generation. And the bold black line is the system demand, and everything above zero is generation, including imports and batteries. And everything below the line is exports and pumping and charging. So what this graph shows is that for these high renewable periods, so we see the high wind there in the blue, it's so important to have that export capacity in the dark green below to be able to get the benefit of those periods. Next slide, please. And conversely, on this graph, which is a period of low renewable generation and high import, so you can see the contrast there in terms of what the system will have to cope with. And this brings me nicely onto the point that in 2030, we will still need other generation to fill the gap when renewables are low or they're not producing as much as we'd like, and for a prolonged period, perhaps. And batteries and interconnection alone cannot plug the gap. And if you remember how I described a Dunkelflaute period, it's a period of prolonged low renewables. And Dunkelflaute, the weather that gives a Dunkelflaute type period, that could affect a large geographical area. So our neighbours could also be affected, and imports simply may not be available. So it's really important that we understand that we still need that other generation in 2030. And now this other generation, it's going to, like gas generation, for example, it's going to be producing about 20% less energy in 2030 than it does today. It's going to have less run hours and therefore less opportunities to provide system services. But we still need the capacity to ensure that we'll still enjoy a system as reliable as we have today in 2030. Next slide, please. And the base case scenario is just one portfolio for achieving emissions reductions in line with what is required under the Paris Climate Agreement. But the report also explores other scenarios that go further than this. For example, swapping one gas-fired generation in the base case with carbon capture and storage would result in additional emissions reduction of 1.1 megatons of CO2. But something like that would need political support and long-term stable policy. Or there's an even more ambitious scenario presented where it looks at additional wind capacity and also the removal of the requirement to have a minimum number of synchronous units on the system at all times. And that would reduce it by a further 2.9 megatons, which is pretty impressive. And the report also looks at what's required beyond 2030. So as I've highlighted today, the study provides insights into the kind of changes that are required to develop a system by 2030 that is on a solid path to net zero in the future. It investigates how the system will cope with weather extremes, and it provides a lot more detail than I've been able to convey in the time available today. It's a fascinating time to be involved in the industry, and the challenges in achieving decarbonisation are not at all trivial, but as we've seen over the last 20 years, the industry can rise to these challenges, and it will continue to do so. So I hope that you read the report and that you enjoy reading it as much as we in the MaREI Centre have enjoyed working on it. I'm sure the report will give you some food for thought and spark some questions about what needs to happen to ensure that timely and appropriate and effective decisions are made so that the all-island system that actually materialises in 2030 is one that at least meets the obligations of the Paris Climate Agreement. So I'll leave it there. So thanks for your time, and I'll pass back to Brian, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Laura. Excellent presentation. We have some questions coming in on Slido, but I would encourage you to please share additional questions that you may have based on what you've seen and heard. We might just take some of those questions, Laura. So one of the questions that's coming through is, in a high renewable generation period, will we really be able to export electricity to neighbouring markets, as they will also have high renewable generation?
Yeah, so we also looked at a scenario that had 10% more renewables in France and the UK. And we found that when there's situations with higher renewables in those countries, it does affect our exports, but we were still showing to be a net exporter. And that's all in the report. So I hope people will read it and see that. Okay,
thank you. Is it realistic to assume that local constraints will be eradicated by 2030?
So the industry has already shown itself to be pioneering. Network reinforcements alone won't get us to where we need to be, just given the timescale. But other solutions, other non-wires solutions could be looked at. Active management at DSO level. All those things will get us to a point where constraints are significantly reduced, if not eradicated.
Thank you. Those two questions were anonymous. Here's a question from Matt Crow. If the 2030 scenario is achieved, what will be the overall fossil renewable ratio for Ireland? Currently, it's approximately 89% fossil and 11% renewable. I can throw in an initial answer
is that
to
in
that.
Terms of, yeah, if it's for the wider energy system,
yes.
I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, I'll let you answer that.
So thanks for that, Matt. Effectively, what we focused on here is the electricity system, and we've taken into account the electrification aspects of the Climate Action Plan. And the Climate Action Plan as a whole is likely to deliver by 2030 a fossil to renewable mix of in and around 70-30. So the renewable energy in the system, in the full energy system, will increase to approximately about 30%. But that depends on other things being achieved outside of electricity, such as biofuel obligations, etc. Another question from Matt. Laura, what's the anticipated contribution of sustainable gas in your estimates for gas utilisation in 2030?
So we didn't include that in our analysis, in that we just looked at, because in the report we look at beyond 2030 as well, and we see that, if I'm understanding the question correctly, we see that more beyond 2030.
Yep, thank you. There's a question here from Davna Gleeson. Can you explain why the DSU value remained unchanged in the 2030 scenario? Would we not expect an increase?
Yeah, so there was a slight increase in the DSU scenario from where it is today, but yeah, I suppose we're just showing one portfolio, and we base that on I suppose we took where we were today, and we looked at where other studies had gone. So we looked at the generation capacity statement, for example, from EirGrid, and looked at where they were predicting things to be by 2030. But absolutely, the portfolio that materializes, the actual portfolio that materializes in 2030 is going to be dictated by the market. So there's no reason why DSUs couldn't be significantly higher than that. And they are very important in terms of providing flexibility to the system.
Thank you. There's another question. The road to zero emissions will really depend on sector couplings. Do the data shown on megaton reduction include this aspect? So I would assume this means that you should talked about a 6.3 million tons reduction.
Yeah, so it's the power system of 2030 that the emissions from that are about 6.3 million tons. It was only in the electrification scenario that I showed what it is for sector-wide, because this report was mainly focused on the electricity system.
Yep. So effectively, the 6.3 million tons would be higher based on the electrification, resulting in emissions reductions elsewhere in heating and transport, essentially. Right. Yeah, thank you. Question here from Rory Monaghan. Fantastic study. The 2030 scenario shows CCS, but I did not see mention of hydrogen or power to gas. What is the reasoning for CCS but no hydrogen, given that both are new technologies?
Okay, so we included the CCS not in the base case, but as a sensitivity, and that's come through in a lot of the analysis in the Paris Climate Agreement, where CCS is shown earlier than other technologies. In the report, as I said, beyond 2030, we've given some options, but we're not proposing one technology over another. It really is up to the policymakers to decide if there's a preferred technology or not.
Thank you. Now, this is another question. Is baseload CCS not simply going to displace cheaper renewables? If you make CCS flexible with less than baseload capacity factor, is it not uneconomic?
Well, CCS, if it was to come along, it would need political support, and it would need long-term stable policy. And I suppose, sorry, could you repeat the question again? I think I missed the second half of it.
So if you make CCS flexible with less than baseload capacity factors, is it not uneconomic? So I suspect what's behind the question is, in some of the variant from the base scenarios, you included one mention of CCS and the additional emissions reductions associated with that.
We did make that a must-run unit in the analysis. We couldn't see a way of not making it must-run, as you said, in terms of making it economically viable.
Great, thank you. There's loads of questions coming in, which is great. We still have, by my calculations, we still have about 5 or 10 minutes more of questions, and then we'll try and get the video from the Minister again. There was a detailed proposal for pump storage using glacial valleys in the west of Ireland some years ago. Is that idea no longer valid? This is from Pádraig Larkin, and this relates to what was called the Spirit of Ireland study. Yeah, so this would be combining large-scale wind with large-scale pump storage.
I'm aware of that study. I suppose where we were going in this study is that we were taking where we are at the moment and looking at where government policy is at in Ireland and in Northern Ireland and the UK, and we built out a portfolio based on those. Just because we presented a portfolio, that doesn't mean that other portfolios aren't precluded, but there is a relatively short time frame between now and 2030, and pump storage projects of those size, they'd be quite long lead times. So I'm not sure that I'd personally see it in the timescales that we have out to 2030.
Thank you. What software did you use to build the model?
So we used Plexus integrated energy modelling software to build a model and to build our pan-European model. So it performs a least cost optimization.
Is it assumed that the emissions trading system will operate in 2030, and what impact is it expected to have relative to the base case modelled?
Will you repeat that question again there? Sorry.
Is it assumed the ETS will operate in 2030, and what impact is it expected to have relative to the base case modelled? I might throw in an initial answer to this one. In essence, and correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, what we were focusing on here was the future targets in terms of the electricity system, rather than specifically the financial mechanisms designed to deliver them. And also it's worth noting that at EU level at the moment, they're discussing whether or not the ETS system will be expanded to include other sectors such as transportation. And so the ETS in 2030 may actually be very different to what it is now. But I think what's behind the question is around that, the measures required to achieve this, perhaps. But my understanding is that that's not what the model, that's not what the project focused on in particular.
No, we're looking at what was needed to achieve effectively a 70 by 30 power system, and to one that would be in line with obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement.
A question here from Dennis Duff. SEAI suggests that full decarbonisation beyond 2030 may need CCS, electrofuels and small nuclear. When will we assess small nuclear reactors, or is Ireland unique? So
we didn't look at nuclear in the timeline out to 2030, as we felt it wasn't a realistic option. And beyond that, it's uncertain. Again, it would depend on what political direction or strategy was taken on that.
Yeah. And I think it was interesting, part of Boris Johnson's top 10 things to do included small-scale nuclear reactors. But of course, in the UK, they have a long tradition there with nuclear. Okay, what policy changes are needed to encourage new flexible electrification of heat? Would it be supplier changes in the market, use of system charges, PSO levies, or other? Again, this I think goes outside the scope.
Outside the scope, yeah.
Another question then. Great study. The economics look challenging for the backup generation if they rarely run. What will keep them on the system? I think you had it as a must run, did you? Sorry.
No. Like gas-fired generation wasn't made must run, other than there was a requirement for a certain number of synchronous units on the system at all times. That min units constraint. But it is going to be challenging, and really that's a question for the policymakers, and it's those kind of things that need to be looked at in the very near future, to make sure that there is other capacity of other generation there for those Dunkelflaute type periods.
Question from Cormac Madden. Was there any district heating included in the study?
Not specifically, no.
Question from Conal Boland. Do we have adequate interconnection capacity to achieve these ambitions?
So we've assumed in the study that interconnection has increased from what it is today. So we've included the Ireland-France interconnector, the Celtic interconnector as it's known as, and also the Ireland-UK or Greenlink interconnector. And we also assumed that we have full capacity on the existing interconnectors, the Moyle and East-West, in both directions.
Question from John Riley. A feature of the analysis is the level of conventional backup required in a market currently designed as energy only. How do we deal with this pressing issue?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Brian?
Yes, a feature of the analysis is the level of conventional, oh, it's gone off my screen, sorry. A feature of the analysis is the level of conventional backup required in a market currently designed as energy only. How do we deal with this pressing issue? I think it's probably more on the policy side to deliver. Yeah. But if
as I said, like the report is to spark questions. What questions need to be answered next, and give food for thought. It doesn't have all of the answers.
Yeah. So that's a good follow-up question then, and the numbers in the report will help inform or refine that question.
Exactly. Yeah.
Question from Barry Hussey. Are the results of the study still broadly the same if the level of demand growth is lower than forecasts in the GCS, the generation capacity statement?
Sorry, say again, Brian.
Are the results still broadly the same if the level of demand growth is lower than what's forecast in EirGrid's generation capacity statement?
Okay, so our lower electrification scenario has a lower demand in it, and the results of that are in the report, in that it has a lower demand because there's lower electrification, but the rest of the scenarios are all based on the demand that's in a base demand, and we took demand growth in terms of data centres and electrification, and we based that on what was in the generation capacity statement.
Great. There's still more questions coming in, which is great, but I think we will need to move on. Will we try and show the video again, or will we move on to the next speaker?
Let's move on to Mr. Rodgers, Richard, and
okay.
Mr. Richard Rodgers, and we'll do Mr. Ryan's video at the very end, Brian.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so that has been a great session, and thanks very much for the questions. Please do keep the questions coming in. And I'm delighted now to introduce Richard Rodgers, who's Head of Energy in the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland. So, Richard, over to you, please.
Thanks, Brian, for my dark, dreich, damp day up in County Down. It's thanks for the opportunity to input today's session and comment on what is a very important report. Next slide, please. Just a quick update on what we're doing up in Northern Ireland. We're developing a new energy strategy that has a vision that we will have a net zero energy mix that grows our economy and is achieved in the most cost-effective way for consumers. Now, that's all in the context of the UK having legislated for net zero emissions by 2050. And it's vitally important that we protect the competitive advantage that we've developed over the past few decades across the island in terms of the cost of our energy. We can't end up with energy being non-competitive, yet we've got to get to net zero, because our businesses have to be competitive, and also we need to continue to tackle the scourge of fuel poverty. So progress to date has been that we issued a call for evidence last December. We had 161 responses, which are all now published, and it shows you the real interest that there is in the work that we're doing. We will issue an options consultation that will be focused on low regrets and no regrets to 2030. In March 21, and the intention would be we'll land the new energy strategy that will be living, breathing for the next 29 years by this time next year, hopefully with any luck in time for COP26 in Glasgow. Next slide, please. So, as has been mentioned already this morning, we are a regional leader in renewable electricity. We've got to 48% of the electricity generated in this part of the world is from renewable sources. But that also makes us a leader too in dispatch time. And it's quite a significant figure, 15% in Q1 this year of the available wind and to a small extent solar capacity that was available had to be dispatched down, so the wind had to be switched off, and that's not good. It's not good for people who have invested in the wind turbine. It's not good for the fact that we've got wind that's available, but we can't use it to generate electricity. But it has to be said that, you know, across SONI and EirGrid, the system operators, NIE and ESB, the network operators, we have had engineering solutions that are groundbreaking, and we've got to the point of where, you know, 65% at any one time can be renewables on the system, and that's moving, all been well, to 75% imminently. And as the report suggests, that we need to get to 2030 to 85% across the island. But the solutions aren't there yet. But if you turn the clock back 10 years and you look what has been achieved since then, it is remarkable. So we need to look at what the capacity we've developed across the island and continue to lead in order to achieve our objectives. The other thing to mention is that we already have installed renewable capacity in Northern Ireland that's 85% of our peak day demand. That's quite considerable, and some people will say, well, why do you need any more? Well, the reality is, with electrification to an extent, heat and indeed transport, we're going to need an awful lot more capacity. And in order to get to 100% net zero energy, we're going to need significant overcapacity. And I like the way the report talks about the flexibility it's needed and the solid long-term policy direction, because we're going to need, and people have already been asking this morning about the role of hydrogen. Hydrogen is one of the significant potential opportunities for true flexibility in the energy system as a whole. The Committee for Climate Change, who advised the UK government in London, they've suggested that the increase in system capacity and electricity across the water will be 250%. The climate plan, the Irish climate plan, talks about increase in wind capacity on the island of 300%. So whatever way we look at it, we're going to need an awful lot more capacity. Some of it will be offshore, but other parts of it will be onshore, and we're going to need more interconnection as well, not just between the islands and between the near continent, but also within the island as a whole. And so it's important that we get on. We build a new interconnector that has been talked about for, well, probably nearly 20 years now. Another important aspect is that despite the fact that our strategy is not landing until next November formally, our minister has already committed to a target of not less than 70% renewables by 2030 to build on that progress from 48%. And that's important because it gives a signal to the industry to continue to develop the projects, and it also provides a consistency with the target that has been set across the border. So, next slide, please. Sorry. Some thoughts on the report, maybe to finish. The report talks about heat pumps and electric vehicles having the potential to more than double the electricity system size, and by that we really mean generation and the network, and we have to do that in a cost-effective way. And certainly the concept of a modern, vibrant gas network system, you know, it either becomes billions of euros stroke pounds worth of stranded asset, or it becomes a flexible system that has decarbonised gas. And certainly the concept of hybrid heat pumps is something that the Committee for Climate Change in GB is becoming quite interested in, because as we all know, heat pumps provide lower temperature water, 45 degrees typically, and they're, you know, at the time when we need to heat most in January and February, then the coefficient of performance is quite low relative to what can be produced, for example, in warmer times in the summer. So it's absolutely clear that hydrogen ought to play a key role in flexibility, and I think it's important that I mention that next week will be groundbreaking, I think, for Northern Ireland, in that our first demonstration size, but nonetheless our first electrolyser will be operational, and that electrolyser will be operational at a wastewater treatment plant owned by NI Water, which is a public company up here, and that the initial output from the electrolyser will be oxygen to testing to increase the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant through oxygenation of the process, and at the same time reducing the amount of electricity that's needed in the process. So probably much the same as down the way with you. Our wastewater treatment plants are under capacity, are under pressure. They're at maxing out, and maybe the electrolysis, which comes from wind that would be otherwise curtailed or constrained, provides the opportunity to provide oxygen to increase the capacity of wastewater treatment, but also provide hydrogen that can then be moved into the transport and the heat sector. So I also comment there on the slide that we totally would agree that there are strong and stable policy signals that are needed to deliver on the climate ambition, and that's something that ourselves in Belfast and our counterparts colleagues in Dublin will be working on to ensure that is provided into the market. Next slide, please. The other thing I thought was helpful to mention, or might be helpful to mention, is that the single electricity market has been really good for consumers across the island. We have lower electricity costs by the day than would otherwise be the case if we didn't have the SEM. It has been great, and this is recognised in its protection through the IENI protocol. But what is absolutely right is we need to work hard to resolve the east-west trading conundrum, and come 1st of January, prices will increase because we aren't able to trade day ahead across the interconnectors. And that's something that ourselves in Belfast, our colleagues in London and in Dublin are working with the Commission as part of the negotiations to resolve as quickly as possible. And the other aspect of the SEM is that we must maintain the level playing field across the island in the new world of post-EU for the UK, for all consumers, market participants and investors, and that's referred to in the report as policy coordination and cooperation mechanism, vitally important for the SEM. And just on to the final slide. So in conclusion, we very much up in the Department for the Economy and our energy team welcome the publication of Laura and Paul's report. It'll be part of the evidence base that will help us in the development of the new energy strategy. And I think they've done a great job in factually representing the position that we are in Northern Ireland, and we find that the commentary and discussion is very helpful. And we look forward to continuing to build on the positive working relationships across the island to protect energy consumers and deliver on all of our climate change commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was excellent. Very insightful, and it was very interesting to get that perspective at this time. There's a couple of questions coming in, and I would encourage more, and I have a couple of questions myself. Just one that it touches on you mentioned the need to resolve east-west trading, and there's a question from Warren O'Neill. Well, it's related to the study, but there's a wider context to it. Did the study take into account the fact that GB will be removed from the Euphemia market coupling due to Brexit? This will likely lead to less optimal interconnector flow. It's a question about the study, but I'd like your reflections on that, Richard, if that's okay. Just in terms of if GB, well, the fact that GB will be removed from the Euphemia market coupling, will this lead to less optimal IC flow?
Okay, Brian, I'm going to try and not get too technical an answer to this and just keep it broad. I would reflect on mutual energy and the Moyle interconnector, which is obviously the interconnection between Northern Ireland and Scotland. And for a long time we were able to import more than we've been able to export. And I find it quite ironic that at a time that Mutual have been able to announce that they've reached an agreement with the Scottish authorities to increase the export capacity from, I think the numbers are 80 megawatts to 250 megawatts. It's at the very same time that day-ahead trading is not possible because of EU exit. And in the detail, as I mentioned about Euphemia and the databases and the systems to support it. But at the heart of it really is getting an agreement between the UK and the EU. At this point, as I understand it, because of the protocol, we are in the Northern Ireland part of the EU in that discussion. And we desperately need an answer. We need to work to get to an answer. It's in the middle of a lot of more complex detail and negotiations, and who knows where that is going to end in the next few days. But what's vitally important for consumers of electricity on the island is that that capacity that has now been achieved in terms of export can be utilised. And if you look at readiness metrics for the 1st of January, they say that the supply of electricity across the interconnectors is secure. Well, of course it is, but the reality is the interconnectors are likely to be quite empty, because effectively participants are unlikely to want to take the risk of balancing and penalty charges on the day. So they'll be securing their requirements day ahead, and natural economics, supply and demand, will say they'll therefore be driving the price up, because there'll be more demand for the electricity just produced on the island rather than electricity that can be brought in through the interconnector. So it's certainly disappointing where we're at, but it's one of the outworkings at the moment of EU exit. But hopefully we can find a resolution between the 3 or 4 parties that are involved in the coming days and weeks.
Great. 2 more questions. Richard, what are the gaps for the development of more interconnections between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, given that interconnections are a crucial asset for achieving zero emissions? And you highlighted yourself, of course, the need for more interconnection across the island.
Yeah, well, I mean, last night it was quite calm up in this part of the world, and we see that when it's quite calm, if you get a trip on the thermal plant, then you get tighter margins, and therefore when you have interconnection, then we're able to bring electricity from other parts of the island where it might be windy. And somebody asked a question earlier about windiness, and it's fascinating how the weather systems, you can quite regularly see, because of our position in the world, that it can be quite windy in the northwest and it can be quite calm in the southeast, and that's where there's great export opportunity to England and indeed to France in due course. But I do, we have known on the island as a whole that there's a need for a new north-south interconnector. It's been talked about for so long. It's been through planning approval in the Republic of Ireland, it's been through the courts, and in Northern Ireland it was caught up in the demise of the previous demise of the Assembly. So now we've got the position where the Minister for Infrastructure has approved planning for the north-south interconnector, and a leave to take judicial review has been granted, and that's expected to be heard in the courts up here early in the new year. So, for a long time, the department has been a long-time supporter with the utility regulator and with the electricity industry to get this interconnector built. But quite clearly, the more interconnection, then the more we're able to use the capacity that's going to be built, the additional capacity going to be built in wind across the island in the coming years and decades. Great.
Final question. You mentioned hydrogen and the innovative work that's taking place in Northern Ireland, and it's interesting because Rory Monaghan raised a question earlier, and I know he's collaborating on the GenCom project. But one of the interesting things in terms of the role of hydrogen that I'd like your reflections on, essentially, as Laura highlighted, this particular study focuses on 70 by 30. And it's really responding to the Climate Action Plan, which was published last year. But this year we have much more ambition in terms of emissions reduction for the programme for government. And that may, one of the things that may arise from that is a need to accelerate research and development in the area of hydrogen. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that in the context of the evolving Northern Ireland energy strategy.
Well, for decades, if you go back to Victorian times even, the advent of fossil fuels, coal, and subsequently oil and gas, when people talk about the cost of support schemes for the development of renewable energy, they quite often forget about the fact that every kilowatt hour of energy that we use in transport, power and heat sends some money out to some other part of the world. And when we've got this indigenous wind, it's a fantastic opportunity to turn, to actually export energy, and we are already doing some of that through the interconnection. not being able to use the wind when it's there is clearly an inefficiency, and certainly, you know, there was a question earlier about demand side units. Clearly, electrolyzers, megawatt size electrolyzers can provide a dispatchable demand. You know, you've got battery storage as one very important area going forward, but you've also got the opportunity of bringing on electrolyzers to utilize the electricity that would otherwise be the generation otherwise be dispatched down. There's GenCom, as you mentioned. That's an EU linked project that's been going for two or 3 years now, and you know, early in the new year, the first hydrogen fuel cell buses will be being refueled under the GenCom project at TransLink. And as I mentioned earlier, this exciting opportunity with NI Water, and the great thing up here is that we've got the public bus company, the public water company, and government, and it's all surprisingly, some might say, joined up. It is fantastic. We've also got the NUIG working on some research as part of our work on the energy strategy on hydrogen. Some good work being done there. So I just think you know, hydrogen, electrolyzers, whether it's green hydrogen or whether it's blue hydrogen, and that's of interest to the thermal plants that are on the island at the moment as well. I think there's a great opportunity for Ireland, north and south, to become an absolute leader in the development of the hydrogen economy. There is going to be so much demand in the EU. The EU missives about that have already demonstrated that that's it. But we just need to get ahead of the curve and stay ahead of the curve. And this is not an either or. I mean, somebody talks about there is no silver bullet. It's silver buckshot, and silver buckshot really means that we're going to have lots of pieces of the jigsaw to put together. And certainly the concept that excites me is, rather than having a stranded pipeline assets, we would have hybrid heat pumps. Electrification leads the way, but then you can provide the flexibility behind from the molecules that are hydrogen and other things like it. So look, it is an exciting time. It is the third revolution, I call it, in energy, and we need to create some really innovative solutions over the coming years in this part of the world.
Richard, thanks very much. That's inspiring, and I really appreciate the time you took to reflect on the report and to answer our questions. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Apologies, Brian, I'm having to slip away, but thanks for the opportunity, and we'll speak again.
We'll speak again. All the best. I'm delighted now to turn to Henning Heider from Eurelectric. Henning is the Director of Policy Issues. So Henning, if you could give us your reflections, please, and then there'll be some questions as well. Thank you very much.
Henning, you're live. Thanks, Henning. You can go, Henning, yes.
Okay, hello and thank you everybody. Good morning. I'm Henning Heider. I am the Policy Director at Eurelectric, and I'm very happy to be joining you today. Now, I've put the organizers through a lot with this IT preparation, so I will be my own speaker and my own moderator this morning. So I hope you bear with me, and I will do my very best to also answer your questions after I did my intervention. So the reason why I think I can provide value to the panel here is to put this all a bit into a European perspective. I represent Eurelectric. We are the European Association for the Electricity Sector. EAI is our member from Ireland, and basically that is the reason why we have worked together in the past for the European scope, and then for the national scope for Ireland here, this is a super opportunity. So 2 years ago, the entire membership of Eurelectric came together to make a big study, jointly committed to carbon neutral power supply well before 2050. We worked with McKinsey to develop some studies, and I would use a bit the numbers that we got from that to put that into context of what we saw today from the colleagues speaking before me. I would stick to 3 key observations that I've made, and then we should still have some time to discuss and have some questions. The key thing for our study is that at the time we were not able to look into the national circumstances. What we found was there are very internationally shared opportunities and challenges, but when it comes to really what is the pathway for each country, we were not able to do that. And so that's why I'm really happy to see this study come forward. It's a great study. I congratulate a lot to it, to really look into what is the intrinsic situation that you're facing, what is your national, or in this case also for the entire island, opportunities that you can face. And I've noted basically three things, as I said, that I think are most noteworthy here. First thing is that, so where does Ireland stand right now, and where is it heading compared to other European countries or in the context of the European Union? At right now at around 35% RES-E in the mix, Ireland is a little above the EU average. And doubling that to the ambitious 70% in just over a decade is quite daring. It's very accelerated movement. It will require a lot of financial mobilization. It will require lots of investments. Putting Ireland to around 70% RES-E would make it jump basically just above the EU average in what we expect the European electricity system on average to have as RES in the mix by 2030. So that is a really good spot to be in, I would say. On the other hand, it doesn't really, when you just take the number plain, it doesn't take into account the challenge that Ireland has with given its geographic position and the need for flexibility and needing to basically deal with the entire system yourself apart from the limited interconnection that you can have. What I noticed as well is essentially that the emissions that you foresee for your power system with about 6.2 megatons in 2030, that would put Ireland on a trajectory, at least the power sector, on a trajectory to meet the Paris Agreement. And that's great to see. That's what we've all been signing up to. And that's really interesting. And then with the 70% RES-E in the mix, that would essentially mean that you would have to continue that path after 2030, but I'll get to that in a moment. Now, another number that I noticed that I found very interesting is the cumulative investment needed, 32 billion euros. That is, of course, a lot of money. But it is not specifically out of line with what we have developed and when we looked into what is needed to spend this. When we were looking on a European scale, we thought that year on year for generation and storage, the European member states would need to spend around 100 billion euros in order to get the system to where we need to be fully decarbonized by 2045. That's a lot of money, but at the same time, it's a lot less money than we thought it would be several years ago, and that is due to the tremendous decrease in cost for clean technologies over the last few years. And I'm not just talking renewables, but also the transition enabling technologies around flexibility, batteries, and the likes. Yeah, coming back to the situation that this is modeled specifically for an island, and we in Europe, or as Eurelectric, we had modeled very high decarb scenarios for the entire European Union. So that means the deeper you go in decarbonization, the more flexibility you need. And that also means the more interconnections you need. And that's what made it feasible, essentially. That was one of the first takeaways from our study. It's extremely difficult to achieve this given the situation here. So putting islands against the EU average is not so easy. And then the last item for my first observation is the tremendous increase in electrification that we see. We see that for Europe in general, but also in Ireland, we see a basically year-on-year growth of 3%, and that is really significant. I mean, that is really high. It also stands, however, against a relatively low starting point right now of, I think it's 16% electrification, so 16% share of electricity in the overall energy demand, and that is, or energy consumption, and that is something where Ireland is looking to catch up. And we saw also in the numbers earlier from Laura and the others that the electrification is really interesting, and that brings me to my second point here, which is basically taking the wider economy into account. Ireland faces a big challenge here as well, and not unlike in other countries, the power sector will be playing the key role. So the power sector not only has to decarbonize what it is currently looking at, but it is also looking to decarbonize or to enable the decarbonization of these other sectors, because in a broader net neutral scenario for the entire island, you cannot not have these sectors decarbonize. And there you have heating, which is 93% fossil today. There's a long way to go here. And I'm really inspired by what I've heard already from the other speakers about hybrid heat pumps, about heat pumps, getting the flexibility from that. It's a lot to do. And here Ireland, I think, faces similar challenges as the rest of the European Union: low renovation rates, aged buildings, funding not being used properly. And that's something that I look forward to discussing with the colleagues in Brussels going forward. On transport, Ireland is also very low in electrification, with 1% right now. That's not unusual. Most of European countries are like this, but it is also one of the sectors that is really key to enable flexibility again for the system, to have these batteries parked 90% of the time, feeding back into the system, doing a lot, and therefore minimizing the need for external interconnections flexibility, to have the system as much flexible within Ireland as possible. And the last thing, not much to discuss here, it's just an observation, is a key challenge for Ireland is also the extremely high emissions coming from agriculture. When we looked into our study, we realized there's nothing we can do here from the power sector point of view, so someone else has to figure that out. But I think 34% is foreseen in emissions from the agriculture. That is significant, and that's a challenge that that I think is something that needs to be looked into in detail. And then the final observation that I would go to is the big elephant in the room, so to speak, is so you're going adventurous, you're going ambitious to 2030, you're doing all the right things, and by 2030 you will have run out of low-hanging fruits. You will have increased renewables production to a level where the flexibility can still be handled given your current constraints. You will have moved difficult sectors in the right direction already, but you still have a significant amount of emissions from the power sector, and you still have a long way to go, essentially. There I found it interesting. There was the opportunity, or the study looked into, what if we add 5 gigawatts more of wind into the mix? That would essentially cut emissions from the power sector in half. But it would also significantly increase the need for flexibility here. And that's, again, feeding back to, now you're on an island, how do you handle that? And you can do this, of course, with EVs, with heat pumps, demand response. All of this is in the making. But it's clear to me, at least, and I would be happy to correct it if I'm wrong, is that more interconnections would be needed to Northern Ireland, to England, to France. And that is where it gets tricky, both politically and also financially, of course, where you need to have this certainty for investors to move forward with that. And that then translates again back to, independent of whether these physical interconnectors work, we need to have a very good working European energy market and an international energy market. And Ireland is in a position there where all of these factors have to come together in order to move further from that. So that is a big challenge that I would be keen to support from Brussels on, to help facilitate here. So in light of this, I think the report highlights very nicely the urgent need to develop and cooperate on the long term, to see, okay, up to 2030, here's the key things we need to do, but also to bear into mind these other sectors, they really need to step up. They need to get out of the comfort zone and be carrying their weight, and the power sector needs to be ready. And I think the power sector in Ireland shows that strongly, is to say we're ready to step up and we can provide this clean electricity for them to decarbonize. And essentially the heavy lifting has to be shared going forward. One item that I don't think I'll go into because we don't have time is, when you go into this very deep decarbonization, then there's the issue of social acceptance. That's something that we found as well, and that's something that I would be keen to discuss as well. When you really use up all your renewable potential, it will have an impact on customers in many different ways. So that's something. So those are my key points. Once again, I congratulate both the Irish Association, but also MaREI on the report. It's great to have these insights to help us also in Brussels put more into context our very high-level bird's eye analyses that we carry forward here. It's very interesting times here in Brussels in terms of legislation and setting up the frameworks to enable member states, or Ireland as an island here in general, to really get their national framework straight to deliver on this. So there's a lot of relevant items here from this report that we can take forward when we're discussing with the Commission or with parliamentarians. And I look forward to discussing with Dara and his colleagues and how we can work together to make this happen. EAI is a very constructive, active member of Eurelectric, and basically in the context of now increased ambition reduction to 55% by 2030 from the Commission, this comes at a very good time. So this would be my initial comments here, and now I would ask you to bear with me so I can read questions that are coming in. I'll just take those off the top here. What benefits do other small Eurelectric members hope to achieve from using small modular reactors by 2030? That's a very good question. I actually noted this down immediately because I had heard that you earlier mentioned this, and this is a topic in several different member states. We actually have a working group that looks into thermal and nuclear reaction, and we have just last week published a short position paper on the potential and the opportunities that that Europe could have from small modular reactors, essentially. This is very much driven, of course, by those countries that face similar situations, that have either problems with interconnection, or countries that are landlocked and they have very little renewable potential, or at least not nearly enough to provide the capacity for decarbonizing their entire system without nuclear. So Czech Republic, Hungary, countries like this. Basically, what we see is that although the technology is not there yet, we should not cast it aside, because nuclear can often be, especially in Brussels, a very dogmatic discussion. The benefits would be, of course, that ideally you would be able to get the system online, have something that is flexible, that enables you flexible, but at the same time that provides good secure capacity. And at the same time, ideally, but I'm no expert here, it would not come with a price tag that an entire nuclear power station, including the rest of it all, would mean. So hopefully it would also, from the financial point of view, come with less risks and less red tape. That is the hope that I would have. But I'd be very keen to pick this discussion up with you in the context of what we've just published to see how we move forward here. To be fair with you, in Brussels, the discussion on this is absolutely nowhere. It's very difficult to discuss nuclear with policymakers on a high level. They are very, very difficult to approach with this, so we have to be smart about it. Next question here. Increased requirement for flexible backup for intermittent reses in all presentations and questions. Powering existing fleet with hydrogen. So I will take this question to basically say, yes, so we need flexible generation going forward. I can give you a feedback on how we saw this in our big study is, and I can also make a reference to CCS because we had a question about this as well. Why is CCS not so present? It's not so present in our study, for example. The reason is simply that we were doing a cost-efficient study, and in the long term, we did not see that CCS would be cost competitive against renewables with other flexibility options. There would be a very limited use for flexibility for our sector. It would be used specifically in places where there is a government plan to maintain fossil generation. For example, Poland, they have a national plan to maintain coal in the mix till 2050. And there you need this kind of stuff, but it would not lead to the best cost-efficient scenario. At least that's what the numbers that McKinsey came up with at the time. So it doesn't appear as a deus ex machina for our sector going forward. It would more be renewables backed up with CCGTs that would run potentially only very limited in terms of constraint, but then sometimes also with hydrogen. We had this debate earlier, what role does hydrogen play? From our point of view, hydrogen plays a key role mostly for industry. Hydrogen will be a key driver for capacity additions in member states. So I think the perspective that the previous speaker had about, exporting that hydrogen, becoming a leader here, there is going to be tremendous amount of demand for hydrogen from industry sectors like steel, from chemicals, those who need it either as fuel or as a vector for other fuels or a feedstock. It's going to continue to be very, very sought after. And potentially there's times where the power sector in certain places would compete for this hydrogen in order to fight a system constraint that is temporary in the system. Next on, an immediate redesign of electricity market to include capacity element would be necessary to give island status. EU Commission view. That's a very good question. I'm happy to take that question, go forward to the EU. When I was looking at the capacity increases and the flexibilities that you're looking at, and then also the situation about interconnections and Ireland facing these challenges. I see some similarities in the situation that we see from other EU member states that are islands, like Cyprus, Malta, that has no interconnection at all, that are looking to have specific discussions with the Commission on these items. Eurelectric, in this particular context, we have no view there. What's important to us is that Ireland can have a cost-efficient way to reduce their emissions, to deliver on their commitment, while at the same time staying within what makes sense. Obviously, we see several member states moving forward with capacity markets, with different solutions to constraints to an all-energy system, and we try as Eurelectric to facilitate here to find a balance between a good market operation model and at the same time something that enables member states to step forward. And here's one more question, probably then my time is up. How can considerations of social support and engagement for on and offshore be embedded early in the technical discussions? Social support and engagement. I'm not sure exactly how I should read this. Is this subsidies, or is this more about the support from society? If it comes from society, what we've seen is basically we need to make sure that we have open discussions early with people, that we engage them. We also made a study in Eurelectric to follow up on this. We made a study called Equality, because putting this capacity online is going to tremendously require changes in ambitious laws, and these laws will impact customers and the services and products available to them in many different ways, not just in the electricity sector. And in order to ensure that we don't have that we have social acceptance, we must not be in a situation where policies that enable these deep decarbonization policies trigger further inequalities. Then you have yellow vests coming onto the streets everywhere in Europe. So for example, to say the ETS, is it regressive? We looked into that. How regressive are obligation schemes? How regressive are subsidies? And how regressive are things if you phase out fossil fuel engines for cars? The answer is almost all of them are regressive, and we have to be very smart in how we can counteract this. We cannot do without many of these policies, but we need to be very smart in how we counteract them. And I invite you to look at our report. It's called Equality, to find out what are elements to spot and then counteract these inequality drivers in order to not lose social acceptance. Because if the politicians don't get elected, if they come with ambitious strategies, we won't get them, and then we are going to miss the target altogether, no matter what the industry pledges. I think this is my time, so I would mute myself and go back and hope that everything switches back. But thanks a lot for your questions, and congratulations again to the report. Take care. Thanks.
I'm now delighted to hand over to Dara for final closing remarks. Dara.
Ian, thanks a million for what has been hosting a fantastic morning of discussion from a national, an all-island and a European perspective. I think what comes across when you listen to all the speakers is this is a scenario, it's a postcard from the future, and it sets out, no matter what that future is, it sets out a common challenge, and that is the challenge of swapping the petrol in our cars and the kerosene in our boilers for plugs. And if we are to meet this challenge, we really have to take the carbon out of the economy, and we do that by taking the carbon out of electricity generation. But it's very clear from Laura's excellent work that the system, as projected to meet the government's policy objective in 2030, the system will be 40% larger, but will emit half of the carbon emissions of today. And it's interesting listening to the EPA's results, which were published in a breakfast meeting this morning. This follows on 46% greenhouse gas reductions by the energy sector since 2001. So we have to do it all again, but in a much shorter period, which really puts the challenge in perspective. But it's also clear that in 2030, in order to grow our renewables, we also need to grow our flexible generation. And in 2030, that flexible generation will be gas generation, and it will be essential, but it will be used less. And I think that shows the pathway we're on to this net zero economy. It's just one milestone along that way. But we also need a much more flexible and agile electricity grid to absorb the projected levels of weather-dependent generation. And if we go beyond current government policy to add more wind in the system, that pressure to get a flexible and agile electricity grid increases even further. But context of time, we've 1 year gone into the third decade of this millennium, and we only have 9 left in order to halve the emissions from the electricity sector by 2030. So a lot of speakers have talked about, and it's very opportune with what Minister Ryan is trying to do, what Richard is trying to do, what Europe is trying to do, and that is this coordination of policy. And we would advocate that has to happen on an all-island basis. It's policy, it's planning, it's investment, and all of those have to come together to facilitate the increasing levels of electricity that will be generated renewably. But a key to those incentives investments will be the achievement of much faster rates of switching from high carbon fossil fuel to electric heat pumps and vehicles. If we don't do that, there will be no customers for the wind that is being generated, wind energy that is being generated. So I suppose the key point is, just with so little time, the decisions on what we invest in and how we invest have to happen now. We heard that term from Richard, this no regrets approach. There is so much that we can invest in now that will have no regrets for future generations. And to use a term from COVID, we can flatten the emission reductions curve on the way to a net zero if we work smartly and invest in both the software and the hardware that will be required. I think this report also highlights security of supply, and it is very timely because the government is planning to consult on that issue shortly, and we'll definitely encourage that. But this report is entitled Our Zero Emission Future. So look, turning to post 2030, those early decisions on appropriate technologies, and we had a lot of discussion there about carbon capture and storage, about hydrogen, some about modular nuclear. But all of these options come with inherent uncertainty, but they share a requirement for a significant amount of carbon investment, long lead in times for construction. So what we would advocate for is that there is, and EAI is technology neutral, it doesn't back any particular technology, but we need to now discuss the cost and benefits of the best technology options for an all-island system. And it is an island system, and it is, as Henning reminded us, it is a much smaller system compared to Europe. And even if we attain 70% renewables by 2030, we'll only be about the EU average, and yet we have so many challenges. But the technology decisions that we need to decide on will be the technologies that will take the last tons of carbon out of the electricity system, and that's why it's very important. This is only a postcard. It is one scenario. We think it's a very good scenario because it is a scenario based on the government achieving its policy objectives. All the inputs are based on published data by EirGrid and everyone else to give us the best guess. And now the next stage is, how do we engage? And the Minister said it, and Richard Rodgers said it, is how do we engage in a holistic view of the Irish energy system, as opposed to an us and them or neither or. It will be a combination. I love that idea of not a silver bullet, but silver buckshot that is needed, that Richard Rodgers talked about. So in conclusion, I really want to talk someone who's behind the scenes, who hasn't been mentioned at all here, and that's Aoife Dunn, for her Trojan efforts to try and work through Skype, Teams, pre-recorded videos and all of that. So Aoife, you did a fantastic job, but also to you, Brian, for your excellent hosting of this conference, and the MaREI Centre for using all of their infrastructure but more particularly to Laura, who not only authored this fantastic report, but was valiantly was able to answer so many of the questions that were flung at her, and Paul Dean, who has been fantastic in supporting us all to get this report up and running. But the speakers were marvellous. Minister Ryan, it was great that all these busy people, Richard Rodgers, Henning Hader, were able to review our report and really try and add some value to their inputs by putting this report in the context of their job, for Richard's job of putting together a Northern Ireland strategy, of Eamon's job of being trying to get the new programme for government up and running, and for Henning's job too of being making sure that the electricity sector in a European context really plays its full role. So with that, Brian, I was going to bring the webinar to a close to thank all of you who have logged on to the webinar, and as it's Friday, wish you all a weekend, and hopefully for those who enjoy rugby that we have a good win tomorrow. So thank you very much.